Napoleon Bonaparte is, without doubt, one of the most significant figures of 19th century Europe. Elected as the first consul of France in 1799, he declared himself emperor in 1804 and embarked on a massive bid to conquer Europe, as well as engaging in a bitter struggle with England. A brilliant strategist and an incomparable head of state, he nevertheless suffered defeats, firstly in Spain and then in the Russian campaign of 1812. These setbacks led him to abdicate in 1814, and the deposed emperor was sent into exile on the island of Elba, of which he was counted king. But the world had not heard the last of the so-called Little Corporal. He prepared a daring return in what became known as the 100 Days Campaign. His last bid to regain his power, his army, and France. Just 100 days in which to stake everything to defeat foreign armies and chase Louis XVIII from the throne. 100 days, it turned out, to defeat at Waterloo on the 18th of June, 1815.
Vive l'empereur! Vive l'empereur!
In 1814, the Allied powers defeated Napoleon and forced him into exile on the island of Elba, off the coast of northern Italy. The victors then met in Vienna to settle the future of Europe and France. Before Napoleon's fall, the empire he had carved out meant that he had, under his direct or indirect control, the majority of Europe's 175 million inhabitants, 50 million of them French. The aim of the negotiations was simple: restore the balance between the European powers to prevent any one nation gaining disproportionate power over the others. In that year, 1814, the principal victors had been the Kingdom of Prussia, Great Britain, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire. Defeated France was represented at the talks by Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, an experienced politician and a brilliant diplomat. The philosophy of the Congress of Vienna was entirely based on the principle of a balance of power, long desired by England, which wanted to ensure no single nation dominated the others.
Il ne faut pas qu'il y ait une puissance qui domine le continent.
There must be no power capable of dominating the continent to the point of imposing its own rules, because for British trade it's not a good thing to have a single power having the mastery over continental trade. What's more, if a nation is too powerful, it's bad at the political level too. Before the revolution, Europe had decided that a balance of powers was the best system.
Que le meilleur système, c'était un équilibre.
Napoleon was the heir of the French Revolution. When he became first consul, effectively the Republic's head of state, he inherited a territory far larger than that of France's Ancien Régime. It was already a France with a European dimension, which stretched all the way to the banks of the Rhine and encompassed sister republics. In other words, countries that were dependencies of France. They're known as the vassal states. Napoleon had largely dominated Europe and imposed French rule. This vision was made possible by the fact that at that time, French was the dominant language among the continent's elite. What's more, the ideas behind the revolution, which the Napoleonic Empire continued to propagate, were very welcome among a large section of the population. They can still be seen in the Code Civil. For example, equality of rights, where measures favour ordinary people against the interests of the aristocracy. The ideas of Napoleon's empire were far more modern than those of the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and certainly more than in the empire of the Russian Tsar. In this way, Napoleon was increasingly viewed as a beacon of modernity by certain influential and highly thought of Europeans, such as the great German philosophical thinkers like Goethe and Hegel, who saw Napoleon as a man of the future. But the empire was becoming less and less acceptable to the people of the conquered lands, because French domination was too strong. From the moment Napoleon declared a continental blockade against England and prevented the flow of products to and from Great Britain, he undermined the trade and supply systems of entire countries. For the major ports of Europe, it caused a catastrophic decline. Ordinary people were also affected, finding themselves unable to obtain a wide range of products, such as coffee or sugar. Furthermore, the Napoleonic Empire was hard to accept for those countries that had been defeated by France, such as the Habsburg Empire or the Kingdom of Prussia, which had been obliged to come to terms with Napoleon. The countries had lost territory and harboured thoughts of revenge. It was the Russian campaign of 1812 that brought about the fall of the empire. At the time, Napoleon was at the peak of his glory. He reigned supreme over almost the entire continent. But diplomatic tensions with Tsar Alexander worsened. Russia, rich in raw materials but with precious few manufacturing industries, suffered hugely from the continental trade embargo. Alexander decided to lift the blockade, which infuriated Napoleon and led him on the road to war. It was a campaign badly planned and militarily reckless. The Grande Armée invaded Russia. The fighting was very violent. Lacking both victories and the ultimate prize, Moscow, the French were forced to fight a rearguard action as they retreated. The bitter winter cold and Russia's scorched earth policy literally decimated Napoleon's army. The Russian campaign ended in dismal failure, with hundreds of thousands dead. After this massive defeat, Napoleon's allies began to change sides. They conspired against France to overthrow the rule it had imposed on the continent. And it was Britain that was the driving force behind these new coalitions.
La puissance française était devenue beaucoup trop grande. On n'avait jamais
Here,
vu ça.
French power had become much too great. No one had seen anything like it before.
Donc, on pouvait pas
It was far
composer
greater
avec
than the
des
power of
pays
Louis
aussi
XIV had
puissants.
been. You don't do deals
pas
with a country
normal,
that
quoi.
powerful. It isn't normal. It sows the seeds
Ça
of
portait en
discontent.
soi, des
England
germes
was
de
therefore the driving force of the coalitions
Donc,
against
l'Angleterre a
Napoleonic
été,
France, which had
depuis
become
le début,
too
le moteur.
powerful in their eyes.
des coalitions contre la France napoléonienne qui étaient trop fortes à ses yeux.
After the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, the coalition managed to drive the French army out of Germany. What came next was the campaign in France in 1814, the defeat of Napoleon and his abdication and exile. The European powers gathered in Vienna had to find a new king to occupy the throne of France, who would be legitimate and an ally. The European powers gathered in Vienna had to find a new king to occupy the throne of France, who would be legitimate and an ally. The Congress considered a number of possible candidates. There was Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI, who had been beheaded after the Revolution. They also considered Napoleon's brother, l'Aiglon. Some even considered the possibility of a republic. The Congress finally decided to opt for Louis XVIII, despite his lack of popularity, which could lead to problems in the future. He arrived in France in April 1814 and gave the people who had been denied power a constitutional charter. It was the restoration of the monarchy. Louis XVIII was the King of France and not the King of the French. France was reduced back to the frontiers she'd had in 1792. She was not meant to suffer too much from defeat because a weakened France would upset the balance of powers. Napoleon, exiled on the island of Elba, prepared his revenge. He left the island by boat with one objective in mind: Paris. Napoleon disembarked at Golfe-Juin on the Côte d'Azur, not far from Cannes. French troops occupying the coast were unsure how to react. The deposed emperor was sensible. He preferred to take a route where he knew the people would be on his side. He knew that much of Provence was royalist. He could not go through Avignon or by the Rhone. He chose instead to go via the Alps in the direction of Grenoble. It's not the easiest route because it's mountainous, but he knew he'd find a welcome there. He set out on the way known ever since as the Route Napoléon, through Digne, through Sisteron, through Gap, and through Grenoble. Just before Grenoble, in the Lafri Gorge, infantry units under the command of Marshal Ney were waiting for him.
Maréchal Ney n'est pas là, mais ce sont des troupes qui sont donc envoyées par Louis XVIII.
Marshal Ney wasn't there, but these were the troops sent by Louis XVIII to halt Napoleon in his tracks. This is where the famous incident occurred in which Napoleon went on foot to meet with the soldiers sent to arrest him, and he spoke to them because he'd recognized their regiment. He'd always been able to speak to his soldiers. This was one of his greatest strengths. The soldiers he recognized, of course, were veterans. These were not young recruits. They were people who'd been under arms and fought for Napoleon for a long time. After just a few words of that address, instead of arresting him, they threw themselves into his arms and cheered.
Il l'acclame.
Those first troops rallied to him, and they set off again towards Grenoble. They found the gates of the large town open to them, despite the orders of Louis XVIII to close them. It was the citizens and the soldiers occupying Grenoble who disregarded their orders and welcomed Napoleon. So, there he was, in a larger town which gave him a greater base for his operations. Moreover, it's quite amusing to see how in the French press he's referred to when he arrives as the Corsican ogre, and then this is the usurper, and then it's General Bonaparte, then it's Napoleon, then it's Emperor, and once he reaches Paris, it's His Imperial Majesty.
On lui redonne ses titres.
Marshal Ney was commander-in-chief of the forces charged with halting Napoleon's progress. They finally met in the Auxerre in Burgundy, where the Marshal addressed his troops, saying, "The Bourbon cause is lost forever." He did not have time to go much further, because his soldiers rallied to Napoleon and started cheering. This act established Marshal Ney as one of the most important generals in France, and his speech was the deciding factor in the entire army rejoining the imperial cause. Napoleon crossed Burgundy and continued towards Paris, where Louis XVIII was beginning to get nervous.
Un petit plaisantin va sur la porte.
There was a little joke at the gate of the Tuileries Palace, where a note was attached, as if it was addressed from Napoleon to Louis XVIII. It read, "My cousin, because that is the way to address a sovereign, don't send me any more troops, I have enough. Signed, Napoleon."
Ne m'envoyez plus de soldats, j'en ai assez. Signé Napoléon.
Faced with this reinforced army, Louis XVIII fled to Gand, leaving the palace of the Tuileries empty for the arrival of Napoleon. Once he'd arrived there, the problems began. The emperor had successfully staged his coup d'etat. He's arrived, and Louis XVIII has gone. This alone is an extraordinary achievement. But now the difficulties set in. What's he going to do? How's he going to lead France? He cannot simply return to the role he had as emperor as if his abdication and exile on Elba had never happened. History has changed. So has public opinion. That has to be taken into account.
Donc ceux qui vont en fait soutenir le retour de Napoléon, c'est ce qu'on appellerait aujourd'hui la gauche. À l'époque, c'était
Those who were in
essentiellement les
favour of
libéraux,
Napoleon's
donc,
return were what we
ceux
would
qui
call
étaient
today the
partisans
left.
d'un régime
At that time,
basé
the
sur
liberals
une
essentially
constitution,
favoured a regime based on a
avec
constitution.
comme principal
Their
porte-parole
chief
Benjamin
spokesman was
Constant,
Benjamin
écrivain
Constant,
que l'on
the
connaît.
well-known writer.
Et
So
donc,
Napoleon had to
Napoléon va
make
devoir faire
concessions
des
to the
concessions
liberals,
aux
who would
libéraux
support
qui
him because
le
they
soutiennent,
opposed the
parce que
return
les
of the
libéraux,
monarchy.
évidemment, sont opposés
They knew very well
au
that
retour
Louis
de la
XVIII had
monarchie.
surrounded
Ils ont
himself
compris
with
que Louis XVIII
old
était
aristocrats who
accompagné
wanted their prerogatives
d'une
back.
série,
The most
d'anciens
extreme
nobles
called
qui
themselves
voulaient
the
retrouver
ultras,
leurs
who were even more
prérogatives.
royalist than the
Les
king
plus
himself.
extrémistes étant
So
appelés
the
les
liberals
ultras
gave Napoleon their
les
support,
ultra-royalistes,
but
ceux qui
Napoleon
étaient
had to make
royalistes
concessions
comme le
to
roi.
them, agreeing
Donc les
always to
libéraux
rule
soutiennent
France
Napoléon,
on the
mais
basis
Napoléon
of a
va devoir
constitutional
leur faire
regime.
des concessions.
Don't think
Ce
that
qui fait
Napoleon
que,
was an absolute dictator. There had
Napoléon a
been a
toujours,
constitution
dirigé
under the
la
empire.
France sur la
Of course,
base
it gave him all the
d'un
executive
régime
powers.
constitutionnel. Il ne faut pas s'imaginer que Napoléon était un dictateur absolu. Il avait une constitution sous l'Empire. Évidemment, elle lui conférait l'ensemble des pouvoirs exécutifs, c'est clair.
Napoleon adopted an additional act to the constitution of the empire, largely written by Benjamin Constant. This act, known as the Benjamin, gave more freedom to the press and public opinion. It's impossible to know if this liberal empire could have worked, because Napoleon was banished from Europe before it was ever tried. European leaders again gathered in Vienna. This time, their task is easier. They can discuss how to react to the return of the emperor.
Donc les représentants alliés vont immédiatement refuser la légitimité du pouvoir.
The Allies quickly agreed to reject the legitimacy of Napoleon's power and to refuse to treat with him. Napoleon had made overtures to them. He wanted peace, at least that was what he said. He no longer wanted a European empire and wanted to content himself with making the French happy. Obviously, his forces are much smaller than before. We must remember that France had been invaded and its frontiers returned to where they were at the time of the Revolution. So Napoleon had left France smaller than he'd found it.
Donc Napoléon avait laissé la France plus petite que ce qu'il l'avait trouvée.
Napoleon had scaled back his ambitions, and his desire for peace was probably sincere. But the European powers didn't believe him. In their view, his powers were not legitimate. They gathered their armies to invade France again, and to seize the throne once more. Faced with this threat, the emperor was obliged to rebuild a sizable army very quickly. There was the one left by Louis XVIII, but that's been greatly reduced compared to the one he commanded under the Empire. Napoleon therefore calls on his former soldiers, there are a lot of them, spread widely throughout France's male population. The task of creating an army was carried out during the months of April, May and early June 1815. During this time, the European powers were also getting organised. By the month of May, the Allies had already decided on the armies to face Napoleon: the army of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the army of the Lower Rhine. The Duke of Wellington, who represented Great Britain at the Congress, left Vienna to command the army of the Netherlands, comprised of Dutch, British, Belgian and German units. His forces occupied the north of Belgium and established their headquarters at Brussels. The Prussian army of the Lower Rhine, meanwhile, commanded by Marshal Blucher, set up its headquarters in Namur.
Alors Napoléon va rassembler évidemment une armée face à ces deux-là. Il va donc constituer
Napoleon, of course, must assemble an army to face these two. It will be an army of the north. He has no time to build large forces on all of France's borders. He's aware that there will certainly be an Austrian army trying to invade France via Italy, and another that will come from Spain. So, along these boundaries, he puts observers. In other words, relatively small numbers of troops that can delay the enemy advance. It's the same in the Alsace. So he focuses most of his resources on the northern border, the Belgian border.
Il va concentrer l'essentiel de ses moyens sur la frontière du nord, donc la frontière belge.
The army of the north, which will be Napoleon's last army, musters around the end of May, beginning of June 1815. Napoleon has concocted a plan to separate the armies of Blucher and Wellington. His plan involves an attack in the middle, at Charleroi, with the idea of fighting the first of the two armies to arrive, most likely the Prussians.
Il faut savoir qu'au niveau des effectifs, donc en 1815,
we have to realize that in June 1815, in terms of fighting strength, Napoleon's army of the north comprised very nearly 100,000 men. Each of the other two armies, the army of Wellington and the one of Blucher, also about 100,000 strong. So Napoleon was facing forces that were double his own. His only chance was to fight each of the armies, one after the other. He mustn't let the two armies join together. On the 15th of June, the French army crossed the Sambre at Charleroi and seized the advanced positions of the Prussians. Blucher found a position from which to fight a battle with Napoleon by the banks of the Sambre. So it was there he assembled the Prussian forces. Napoleon advanced, but he didn't know which army was coming to give battle first. On the morning of 16th of June, he sent some of his forces towards Sambre and others towards Brussels. He gave command of the French army's left wing to Marshal Ney, who arrived at Quatre Bras, the crossroads where the Charleroi-Brussels road meets the road between Namur and Nivelles.
Donc le 16 juin, vous avez donc une partie des forces françaises aux Quatre Bras, sous le maréchal Ney, une partie devant Sombref.
So on the 16th of June, you have a party of French troops at Quatre Bras, under the command of Marshal Ney, and a party in front of Sombref, commanded by Napoleon himself. Blucher had the most troops he could muster at Sombref, but he'd been unable to bring up his fourth corps. He had 4 corps, but only had 3 to fight a battle with Napoleon. It's a very important matter because you know that to bring together as many troops as possible is the key to winning a battle. So the Prussian side has had a communication failure because the 4th corps isn't there.
Raté dans la communication puisque le 4e corps ne sera pas là.
Meanwhile, back in Brussels, Wellington is watching for the arrival of the French forces from the direction of Charleroi. When it comes, he's slow to react, fearing a diversionary move to cover up an attack from Mons. That could be disastrous, because the French army would then fall on the British right flank. Wellington finally decided to stop the French advance. During the afternoon, Napoleon attacked Blucher at Sombref-Ligny and broke through. It was a violent confrontation. Blucher himself fell from his horse. He was 72 years old. Fearing defeat, the Prussians made an ordered withdrawal towards Wavre, with the aim of joining up with Wellington's forces. The same day, Marshal Ney fought a battle at Quatre Bras against the Dutch army. The outcome was unclear, but Ney failed to seize the crossroads. The following day, the 17th of June, Wellington learned of Blucher's defeat and decided to withdraw. It would have been too dangerous to remain alone at Quatre Bras while his ally pulled back to Wavre. He decided to retreat onto the plain of Mont-Saint-Jean, otherwise known as Waterloo, a potential battlefield he'd identified the previous year as an ideal place at which to stop a French army. Faced with the Prussian and English withdrawal, Napoleon was slow to reach a decision.
Donc il va envoyer une partie de ses forces, 30 000 hommes en fait, sous le maréchal Grouchy.
So he sent 30,000 of the men under Marshal Ney's command to pursue the Prussians, but Grouchy followed them too far. His mission wasn't very clear, in fact. He didn't have enough men to give battle to the Prussians, but they had too many for a simple reconnaissance mission. Without a doubt, it was a big mistake. Napoleon was deprived of a vital part of his army without giving Grouchy orders to engage the Prussians in battle.
Sans donner comme mission à Grouchy de livrer vraiment bataille aux Prussiens.
Napoleon, meanwhile, with the greater part of his army, went towards Quatre Bras and followed Wellington to the position at Waterloo. On the evening of the 17th of June, he installed himself in the farm of Cailloux, which was to be his last headquarters. It rained heavily, and there was a violent storm that made it hard to move about. The army encamped in the mud. There was very little shelter. Conditions for the French army were a long way from ideal. It was the same for the army of the Netherlands, but Wellington had identified a good position the year before, so some of his units were better sheltered. The following morning, the 18th of June, 1815, the weather improved, but the ground was still very wet. Napoleon was sure Wellington was there and prepared to give battle. The Emperor was happy, convinced that his army was better and more aggressive than that of the Dutch. And he was right.
Messieurs, bon appétit. Et attention à vos gilets blancs. Merci, si. pas un homme facile, votre beau-frère. Hein.
Non, il a un caractère, mais
Il a son caractère. Hein.
il a ses compétences.
Ah, ça c'est absolument certain, mais il y a un petit peu de friction avec mon cousin né. Hein.
Qui ça?
Oui, son beau-frère.
Mon beau-frère.
Qui est resté à Paris.
Davout, le ministre de la Guerre.
Ministre de la Guerre.
Bah, depuis la Russie, faut dire que de toute façon c'était chaud avec tout le monde. Oui. Presque tout le monde. Il avait ses... la marine, il a fait envoyer ces petites...
Oui. Elles viennent de Boulogne-sur-Mer.
Ah, très bien.
C'est mon cher Denis qui a été les pêcher lui-même. Avec le...
No one knew exactly where Blucher was, nor Grouchy for that matter. Obviously Napoleon remained in contact with Grouchy, but communication wasn't easy. The route was far from direct, involving a great many of the roads and tracks of Brabant Wallon. Blucher stayed in contact more or less with Wellington. He assured him of the support of at least one of his army corps. That's why Wellington agreed to do battle. He was confident Blucher would send him reinforcements, without which, alone against Napoleon, Wellington knew he would lose. But he occupied a good defensive position, and so began the famous Battle of Waterloo. Like a wave that spills from a brimming cup, in your arena of woods, hills and valleys, pale death mingled with the grim battalions. On one side is Europe, and the other is France. Bloody shock. God dashed the heroes' hopes. Victory, you deserted us, and we were lost. Oh, Waterloo, I cry, and I stop, alas, because these soldiers of the last war were great. They had conquered the whole earth, hunted down 20 kings, crossed the Alps and the Rhine, and their souls sang in the brazen trumpets. Napoleon's battle plan was simple, as it often proved in the past. It involved penetrating the enemy lines through the centre. That's why he placed a large part of his artillery in the middle of the French line and started to bombard Wellington's lines. But this was exactly what the Duke had expected, and he'd taken up a position that provided shelter for most of his forces. It was behind the edge of a plateau, which meant the men were not too exposed to French artillery fire. Napoleon began his attack with the 1st Infantry Corps. It was a powerful force, commanded by Marshal Ney himself. He adopted a formation that has been much criticised because it was a very deep formation.
Il faut savoir que vous avez des formations d'infanterie qui sont soit en ligne, déployées.
You have to realize that you have infantry formations in deployed lines, which draws the greatest firepower at deep formations. The attacking columns, in other words. In this case, we're firing less, but it's easier to manage. At the outset, the French attack was effective. The soldiers arrived on the plain of Mont-Saint-Jean and repulsed the first English units. There was panic in Wellington's ranks. But the general commanding the British cavalry saw an opportunity to charge the French infantry. It was a possibility that had not been taken sufficiently into account by the French generals who commanded their attack. It was a mistake almost certainly due to haste.
Ça reste un peu un des mystères de la
It
bataille.
remains one of the mysteries of the Battle of
Cette
Waterloo.
précipitation, il faut
Why
mettre
such a
ça, je
hurry?
crois, sur le compte
I think it must be because the
d'une
situation
situation un peu
seemed somewhat
d'urgence.
urgent.
Vous savez, c'est une
As you know,
campagne,
the campaign had been
qui a
largely
été
improvised.
largement improvisée.
This French army was much more
C'est une armée
fanatical
qui
than the
était-
other armies
l'armée
Napoleon
française,
had
une
led
armée
in the
qui est
past.
beaucoup
They
plus
wanted revenge for their
fanatisée que les
defeats
autres
in
armées de
1814.
Napoléon, parce que Napoléon
There was a
revenu,
massive
on
sense
veut
of
se venger des
excitement
défaites de
among the
1814.
soldiers.
Il y a un climat d'excitation assez grand dans cette armée.
The British cavalry attacked the 1st French Infantry Corps and broke it apart. There was a huge number of dead and wounded. The French troops did not react quickly enough and lacked the training to resist an attack by enemy cavalry.
Et elle ne parvient pas, cette infanterie française, à former des carrés, car c'est la formation qui permet de résister à une attaque de cavalerie.
They did not know how to form infantry squares.
Encore une
That's the
fois,
correct formation to
pourquoi?
resist a cavalry
Parce que
charge.
c'est une armée
Because it was a
relativement
largely
improvisée.
improvised army
Les cadres
whose
ont beaucoup
officers had been much
changé
changed
avec la
because of the
restauration,
restoration and the
changement
regime
etc.
changes.
Il y
There
a
was a
un
lack
manque
of mutual understanding on the part
de
of the French
connaissances
units.
mutuelles
This is something
au
that
sein
was
des
pointed
unités
out by
françaises,
many
et ça,
witnesses.
a été souligné
Undoubtedly,
par
this is
plusieurs
one of the
témoins.
factors that explains the total
C'est
disorder.
sans doute une des
Because under
causes qui
normal
explique
circumstances,
ce
the French
désordre
infantry
car
knew very
normalement,
well how to form into squares. They'd done it in
l'infanterie
many
française
battles.
aurait dû pouvoir former des carrés assez vite. Elle l'avait fait dans d'autres batailles.
But the British cavalry couldn't stop. They went on. It's very difficult to stop a horse at full gallop, with men in the saddle who are excited and who think they've won a great victory. So, the British cavalry reaches the enemy batteries and its flank is attacked by the French cavalry and is defeated. Indeed, it's almost completely destroyed. The outcome of this phase, the first proper phase of the Battle of Waterloo, was a draw. The leading French corps had been put out of action, but so too had Wellington's vital cavalry. After a short lull, the French artillery began to step up its bombardment. That's what did the most damage to Wellington's forces. As soon as they advanced a little, the French artillery fired on them and inflicted massive casualties. Wellington decided to pull back his troops a little to escape the enemy fire. Marshal Ney thought it meant the British were retreating and launched a cavalry charge, apparently without consulting Napoleon. It was a premature move. Marshal Ney used the entire reserve cavalry of the French army. In other words, not only the heavy cavalry regiments, but also the cavalry of the Imperial Guard. The terrain made the charge very difficult because the ground was very wet. Conditions were far from ideal for a cavalry charge. The English and their allies formed infantry squares to resist the attack.
Donc ça a été une grosse erreur de la part du maréchal Ney.
It was a massive error on the part of Marshal Ney. The French cavalry were wasted in a series of useless attacks. Of course, made an impression on Wellington's infantry. They found the situation very much to their liking. It was quite impressive to see the armoured soldiers falling under their horses' hooves. They were huge horses too, capable of carrying armoured men, and the men were big as well. They were not just ordinary soldiers, but in the end they had little effect on Wellington's line.
Sur la ligne de Wellington.
It was at that moment that the Prussians arrived on the right flank of the French. Suddenly happy, he cries, "Grouchy!" But it was Blucher. Hope changed sides. The soul of the battle changed too. The howling of the fray swells like a flame. Blucher had kept his word and was able to do what Grouchy had failed to do, still stuck far away near Wavre. He'd come in person with the first corps of his army, followed by a second and a third. He attacked the French right flank. It seems to have come as a complete surprise to the French. Napoleon was obliged to turn his forces towards the right to oppose the Russian troops while they were still engaged by those of Wellington. The task became very difficult because they were then fighting on two fronts. Nevertheless, he positioned his reserves to hold the Prussians. For several hours, the French managed to hold Blucher at bay, but time was running out to resist Wellington. Napoleon decided to resort to an attack by the Imperial Guard, his elite unit, to see if it was possible to break through the centre of Wellington's army. The best regiments of the Old Guard were not involved in the attack at that stage. Their task was to protect the field headquarters. The regiments that attacked were from the middle-ranking Guard, and to begin with they met with some success, but they were peppered with fire from Wellington's infantry, famed for their accurate shooting. They'd just been waiting for the best moment to open fire on the French. At the same time, the Prussians increased their pressure from the right.
L'attaque de la moyenne garde, en fait, échoue d'une part parce que les troupes de Wellington parviennent à l'arrêter.
The attack of the middle-ranking French Guard fails because Wellington's troops managed to stop them with rifle fire, and secondly because when they realized that the Prussians had arrived on their right, the men of the Imperial Guard began to panic. There's nothing more likely to cause panic during a battle than to discover you're being attacked from the side while you still have opponents in front of you. It's a psychological reaction, very human and quite understandable. You cannot face two sides at once. When you're attacked from the rear, you're lost. So the Guard retreated. The withdrawal of the Imperial Guard was to prove the beginning of panic in the French ranks. This is an army that's a bit special compared with other armies Napoleon had led, because it had witnessed turmoil. It's more nervous, having been through regime change. It wants revenge. It's quite fanatical, devoted to Napoleon, but also more fragile.
Elle veut se venger, elle est assez fanatisée, elle est dévouée à Napoléon, mais c'est aussi un instrument plus fragile.
The French army lost confidence from that moment. Panic led to a veritable rout, and the French line collapsed. Men began to run away. The French fell back to Charleroi, saved from their pursuers by the squares of the Old Guard. On the battlefield lie bloodied and mutilated bodies and wounded soldiers whose only hope of survival lies with the military surgeons. It has been a debacle. Napoleon himself goes with his soldiers to Charleroi. Blucher, meanwhile, meets Wellington at the Belle Alliance farm.
Les Prussiens puis les Allemands vont d'ailleurs appeler cette bataille Belle Alliance. Donc, ils ne vont pas l'appeler Waterloo.
The Prussians, like the Germans, have always called this the Battle of Belle Alliance, not Waterloo, because that's where Blucher met Wellington. It obviously puts the emphasis on the part of the battle where the Prussians were engaged. The name Waterloo is given by Wellington because that's where he'd established his field headquarters before and after the battle. What's more, the name sounded good in English. It's easier to pronounce in English than Belle Alliance. That's why he wrote Waterloo in his diary, and that's what gave the battle its name. On the French side, it was called at first the Battle of Mont-Saint-Jean. It's curious to think that at the beginning there were three names for the battle: Waterloo for the British, Mont-Saint-Jean for the French, and Belle Alliance for the Prussians. Now everyone knows it for the name Waterloo.
Côté français, et puis Belle Alliance côté prussien. Mais finalement, tout le monde va se rallier Waterloo.
Napoleon returned to Paris and thought about continuing the war. Not all hope had been lost. He would have to raise new armies, but this would have required the support of the parliamentary chambers. The elected majority was liberal, though, and not conducive to excessive resistance. Napoleon quickly grasps the situation. He can't get his own way.
L'armée qu'il a emmenée à Waterloo, c'est une armée de métier. Il faut savoir qu'il n'a pas pu, Napoléon, lever autant de conscrits qu'il aurait voulu.
The army he took to Waterloo was a professional army. He'd been unable to raise as many conscripts as he would have liked. If it had the support of the majority of French public opinion, he could have raised fresh armies, but to do that he needed the support of the parliamentary chambers. He soon came to realize that the majority of the French people have had enough of making sacrifices and sending young men off to war. He'd known from the outset that this was an all-or-nothing affair. He'd gambled everything on this one campaign. His power was weak. Back in Paris, he quickly realized it was all over.
Il se rend assez vite compte qu'il ne pourra pas continuer.
Napoleon abdicated for a second time in favor of his son, who was 4 years old and in Vienna. He boarded a boat at Rochefort with the intention of sailing to the United States, but he was very quickly stopped by the English fleet. He protested, but he was given no choice. He put his confidence, he said, in the generosity of the English people. It was, of course, the leaders of Europe meeting in Vienna who would decide his fate. This time, he would not be detained on an island in European waters. He was to be deported far away to the island of Sainte Helene in the middle of the South Atlantic. The island was a British possession and had been considered as a place to detain him before he was sent to the island of Elba. He was informed that he would be deported to Sainte Helene and that he could take with him a limited number of his supporters. He would not be king as he had been on Elba. This time he would be kept as a prisoner of the English. Napoleon spent his final years there before his death on the 5th of May 1821. On his deathbed, it seems the spectre of Waterloo continued to haunt him. The final defeat that put an end to his dreams of glory and grandeur. Without a doubt, the destiny of Europe was decided in 1815. Even today, Napoleon remains a legend. Whether you celebrate his glory or his defeat, he has left an indelible chapter in the book of European history. Waterloo, this funereal and lonely plain, this grim field where God stirred annihilation, trembling still, having seen the flight of giants. Napoleon saw them flowing away like a river, men, horses, drums, flags. And in his distress, he feels faintly the return of his remorse. Raising his hands to heaven, he said, "My soldiers dead, myself defeated. My empire is shattered like glass. Is this my punishment this time, harsh God?" Then through the cries, the murmurings, the cannon's roar, he heard the voice answer him, "No."